Every organization runs on information, from customer records and marketing analytics to employee data and vendor insights. But do companies understand their legal responsibilities? And how can we use the personal data to innovate and grow while respecting data privacy laws and not damaging trust? Today, we explore how businesses can balance opportunity with accountability, understanding what data they hold, how they can collect it lawfully, and the frameworks that govern its use. Joining us is Danie Strachan, Senior Privacy Counsel at VeriSafe, who helps organizations around the world navigate the fine line between data use and data abuse. Danie specializes in guiding organizations through the intricacies of privacy and data protection laws, translating complex legal requirements into practical, actionable strategies. He offers external legal guidance on global compliance to clients, and he ensures a balanced approach of legal precision and business pragmatism. Welcome, Danie. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm very much looking forward to learning a bit more about privacy and how we protect ourselves and our data.
Thanks so much for having me.
I'm
glad to be here.
So firstly, to just create some context for, both myself and all our listeners, can you explain to us the difference between personal data and what does confidential mean, what does proprietary mean? All these words that we hear all the time, but we're not really sure of what it means and what it means for us.
Certainly, that's a great question, and I think there's a lot of misconceptions and confusion around all these concepts. So let's start with personal data or personal information, depending on which part of the world you're in. In some parts of the world, they still talk about PII, personally identifiable information, but all of that is information that relates somehow to someone. So it's information typically that identifies someone or that you can use to identify them. So for example, the usual examples, if it's an email address, it might contain your name and surname in the email address. That's definitely personal information. Your name in certain contexts, in most contexts, will be personal information because it's you. But then other things can also be personal information. So for example, your opinions and preferences. So that's very relevant, I think, for people that do marketing surveys and especially ad tech and marketing tech, lots of processing of people's preferences there. So those are just examples of personal information. So it's normally something that identifies someone directly or indirectly. So you can use that information to identify that person. But there is a misconception and confusion about this. So people often think something is personal information unless it's public, for example. And that is wrong. That's a misconception. So just because you can find information about someone on the internet or on LinkedIn, for example, or if it's in some kind of directory or in a book, doesn't mean that it's no longer personal information. It's still someone's information. It still identifies them. You can still use that information to identify the person. So that's one of the first things that we should make very clear is personal information stays personal information, whether or not it's public. So if it's not in the public domain, it's still personal data. If you can access it on the internet or somewhere, it's still personal data. So if you are an organization that does something with people's data, even if you collect that data because it's public information, you still have duties and obligations to look after that information carefully. The other concepts you've mentioned, so confidential information is a concept that you often use in, let's say, in business law or in business interactions. So often you have confidentiality agreements or non-disclosure agreements, and there you often talk about confidential information. Often you'll see a confidentiality clause in a contract, and typically the contract or policy will dictate what is confidential information. So if it's a non-disclosure agreement, you'll say confidential information will include all of the following. So you basically decide when it's confidential or not. So in an employment context, normally all the information that you gather about your company's customers, that will be regarded as confidential information. Proprietary information is a concept that businesses use And in many jurisdictions, this is recognized often as a business's own information. They own that information. So it's not necessarily people's information. So that could be analytical data, business intelligence, not necessarily anything that you can link back to a person. So it's proprietary information, how you do something, your recipe for creating something. So that would be proprietary information. In some countries, they also talk about trade secrets. So that's your special way to do something. It's not out there in the public domain. So if you're a cool drink manufacturer, your recipe for your specific cool drink would be a trade secret. And in some countries, they recognize that as a specific thing that you can own, and you can stop other people from using that. So those are other more business-related concepts. I think for today's discussion, the most important one is personal data, and remembering that personal data can be public or non-public, but it's still information that relates to someone.
That makes sense. So in other words, confidential or personal information can be confidential, but it need not be. It's probably not proprietary. Proprietary is more, as you were saying, like the cool drink recipe, something that you might be able to patent depending on the jurisdiction you're in, etc. Okay,
Exactly.
Okay. Now we have the concepts in hand, and we understand all of that. We can see that there are overlapping concepts in that realm. But how does it actually impact privacy, and how does it impact us? What do we need to understand about all those concepts and personal data specifically from a privacy perspective?
Yeah. So for businesses, the important thing is to realize whether or not you're dealing with personal data. Because if something is personal data, then there's most likely going to be a law that applies to you and what you do with that data. So that's why it's always important to ask yourself the question, if let's say you're developing a new system or something as simple as a questionnaire, let's say you're creating a marketing survey. When you come up with those questions, you have to think, am I going to collect something that might be personal data when someone completes this questionnaire? And if that is the case, then you obviously have to make sure that you comply with all the legal requirements when you process that personal data that you collect. So from a privacy perspective, you need to be able to figure out whether something is personal information or not, because that really dictates what you can do, how you can do it, what laws might or might not apply. The other concept that relates to personal data, and especially in the privacy context, is processing, because almost all data protection or information protection or privacy laws talk about processing. So processing is anything that you can basically do with personal information. So that could be collecting the data by way of a survey or a questionnaire or something, or letting someone fill in a form or complete something online, consulting that information. So once you have the personal data, when you look at it, what you're doing with it, accessing that data, merging it with other data, de-identifying data even is processing, destroying data is processing. So anything that you can do with personal information is processing. And most laws will tell you, if you're processing personal data, then you must comply with these rules. Okay. So that's why it's important to figure out whether or not you are working with personal data, because you can make it very easy or you can make life very difficult for yourself if you're collecting personal data. So let's say you're only interested in figuring out if someone likes a new product or a new system, and that's all you're interested in. You're obviously not interested in when the person was born. You might be interested in the age group, but let's say for now you just want to figure out if someone likes or they don't like this product. Why collect all their personal data if you could get away with merely just getting the analytics out of that? So very important when you're designing a new system or a new process to ask that question, because you're going to either make your life very easy or complicate things for you significantly. And also bearing in mind that many data protection and privacy laws will also say you can only collect such information as you really need. So you can't just collect anything and everything on that person, because you don't have a lawful reason for collecting that. So let's say you're doing this survey. If it's not relevant to figure out whether this person has a university degree or not, why are you asking them what is your highest level of education or what university degree that you obtain, if that's not relevant for what you're doing?
That it makes the discussion hard, and it makes the tact is hard, right? Because now personal data is a very wide definition. Processing is very wide. In my mind, it was always, I have your identity number, I can infer your age. That is processing, but it's also processing, collecting it. It's also processing, destroying it. Yeah. You were speaking about de-identifying, and we use anonymized data quite often, but I've also heard of pseudonymized. So what is the difference? When are you a pseudonym and when are you anonymous? And
so there are three concepts that you normally hear. So the one is anonymous information, or anonymization, if you want to anonymize the data, or pseudonymization. Sometimes you also hear about de-identification. That concept is a bit confusing because in some countries' laws, they use it as if it is anonymization, but in some other countries, de-identification is not the same as anonymization. So really depends on which country you're in and which country's laws we're talking about. So let's keep this general. But these concepts are important because it can help you to do something with data in a compliant way. So if data is truly anonymous, then in most cases, data privacy laws won't apply. So something is anonymous or anonymized if you've broken the link between the data and the person to such an extent that you will never be able to put it together, to put it together again. I always think of Humpty Dumpty. We had a great fall and they couldn't put him together again.
All the king's horses and all the king's...
Exactly. Whenever I'm thinking of anonymization, that comes up. So it's where you break the link to such an extent that there's just absolutely no way that you can get back to the person. It is very difficult. In many regions, so for example, in Europe, there's clear guidance and a very, very high standard for anonymizing something. Because if you think about it, these days, especially with AI and the technology that you have, if you have data and you have contextual data or you have metadata, it's most likely that you'll be able to re-identify the person. So anonymous information is very useful if you want to do stuff and you don't want to comply with data protection laws, but then you'll have to be really, really sure it's anonymous. The other concept is pseudonymized information. Terrible word to pronounce sometimes. So pseudonymized information, I think it sort of speaks for itself. So you give it a pseudonym. So in clinical trials research, for example, they talk about key coding. So they give a patient a code. So when so it's normally a string that's numbers and letters, and that helps the company that does the research to do the research on the data without knowing exactly who that person is. So sometimes you do need to have information that you can somehow link back, or that someone can link back to a person. Because if you think about it, if you're doing medical research and you're doing a trial on a specific product and something goes wrong, you need to be able to figure out where it went wrong and who is affected by that. You might need to contact them. So someone keeps the code normally. So in business context, you often see that where someone does research, they need to have the data. They don't need to know whose data it is, but someone still has the key to unlock the code and get back to the data. So if you think of it as a puzzle, if you have a few pieces of the puzzle and you take it apart, that is normally not anonymization, because you can normally put the puzzle together again. But you can give someone some pieces of the puzzle to study and do something with it, and someone still has the ability to put all the pieces together again so they can see the full picture. And sometimes you need that to do valuable research, because in some contexts it's not sufficient to work on anonymized data. So it really depends on the use case. But those concepts are also important because even though pseudonymized or key-coded information isn't non-personal data, because you can still link it back together again, it is one way to protect the person, because then you reduce the ability out there to see whose information it is. So if you have a researcher, they're just interested in what they're doing. So it's better for them to rather work on pseudonymized information, because if something goes wrong, but you've reduced the likelihood of harm happening here because someone only has access to pseudonymized information, they don't have the code. in that context also, so talking about measures that you can use to protect people when you're doing research or analytics on their data, that's why encryption is also very useful, because if you encrypt data without the code, you can't get to the actual data. And that's why encryption has become best practice around the world. Obviously, which standard of encryption is debatable and difficult, but it's another way to help you do things without creating unnecessary risks for the people involved.
And that is, mouthful, but it does make sense. The one basically Humpty Dumpty, the other, we're building a puzzle, the whole family gets together, but only the one person can see the box picture. I'm building the sky, you're building the river, and I don't really need to see the picture. We'll put it together again, or I can ask the person with the box what this picture looks like if I need it. But I didn't know that you needn't not necessarily comply with data privacy laws if you have fully anonymized. It makes sense.
If it's fully anonymized.
Fully anonymized.
But that's why you must not be able to put Humpty Dumpty together.
Yeah.
That is difficult.
But I think we use that word incorrectly. I think a lot of anonymized data is actually probably just pseudonymized.
Exactly.
Because it's the contextualization, as you were saying. If I know where you are living and what your age is, there are only so many people in that block.
That is the big problem you normally have. So
the sample is really small.
I spoke to people that do impact assessments the other day, and they said, well, we don't do anything with personal data because we do focus groups. We do these studies and we collect the people's data, but then when we compile it, we don't put their names in. And my immediate reaction was, how's that anonymous? Because you still have their names, and they admitted it. They said, yes, we keep it all in file, spreadsheets, but when we create our report, we don't put the people's names in. But you still have a responsibility because you still have the data. You still know whose data it is. You still have your spreadsheet. You still have the picture on the puzzle box to be able to identify those people. So it's challenging sometimes to keep all these concepts together and stay focused, but it's really important because it can really make your life much easier or much more difficult.
Okay, so now moving on, because we've now collected the data, whether it be through research or surveys, or there's some form that I filled in. Do you always need to get consent from the person? Do you need to declare what you're going to do with it? How can you use this data? Is the data ever public? Is my name public just because I have a LinkedIn profile? That sort of thing. How do we go about that?
That's a very good question and a very loaded question. Because there are so many things I can say about this, but let's try and keep it simple. So let's talk about the principles, because all countries, or almost all countries around the world, now have some form of data protection or privacy law. But there are many similarities. They're not the same. This is also a misconception. Everyone thinks that all data protection laws are not the same, and there are these weird differences that can sometimes really trip you up and catch you out. But so let's talk about these principles, because these principles have come a long way, and many of these laws have been based on these principles. So there are principles that were compiled by the OECD, and many people use those principles when they draft data protection laws. So those principles, if you know what those principles are, will at least teach you something about the data protection. And at least if you know what those principles are, you'll be in a much better position when you are creating a new system or looking at some use case and trying to figure out whether there might be a problem or not. So broadly, let's talk about this situation. So the first thing is if you want to collect someone's data, you need to be transparent. So that's the transparency principle. So you have to give notice to them. So if there's a form or a registration portal or whatever you use to collect someone's data, there must be transparency. So that's the privacy notice or the privacy policy you normally see. And that sets out what data we're collecting, who we are, who we're sharing the data with, are we looking after the data, what are your rights if we're collecting your data. So that's the privacy notice, and that's why it's important to have a privacy notice. And to make sure that it's understandable and that people can see it when you're collecting their data. So if you want to collect someone's data, you have to be transparent with it. Then your other question, don't you need their consent? So this is treated differently in many countries' laws. So some countries' laws are very consent driven, and in almost all cases, you need to get consent to collect or use someone's data.
Even if it's implied consent?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. So in many of those jurisdictions, they talk about consent, but then they'll distinguish between express consent or implied consent, but it's very consent driven. And then in other jurisdictions, it's sort of based around the concepts of express or implied consent, but they've crystallized the bases on which you can rely. So, for example, in Europe, the GDPR, which is, I think, the gold standard data protection law, some people might disagree, but it is the well-known, famous law. And it gives you various bases on which you can rely if you want to process someone's data. And in many countries' laws, you're not allowed to do something unless you have a basis that you can stand on. So there is this misconception that means you always need someone's consent. So unless you're in the country where the law does say you cannot do anything without consent, there might be another basis that you can rely on. So let's say, for example, you are a bank and there's an anti-money laundering law that says you must verify your new customers and figure out who they are. So in South Africa, for example, that's the FICA Act. So if you have a legal obligation to verify someone's identity before you open an account for them, then you don't need their consent because you're under a legal obligation to do this. If you are required by someone, a customer, to provide a service to them, if I'm a courier company and I need to deliver a box to you, how am I going to deliver it without your address? So I don't need your consent to use your address because I'm providing a service.
But I signed up for. I want it delivered.
Yeah.
Here's my address. Be safe. Bring it here.
And then there's, in many countries' laws, this nebulous concept of legitimate interest. And that's when it gets tricky, because there are many countries where you can use someone's data if it's in your legitimate interest, or in some other countries' laws, it will say in someone else's legitimate interest. So that is a difficult basis to rely on, but a useful basis if you don't want to, or it would be inappropriate to collect someone's consent. Because remember, if you collect someone's consent, that means that they can at some stage maybe withdraw their consent, and then you must stop. Then you can't suddenly say, okay, now let's try and figure out another basis for doing this. So it's actually not a great idea to rely on consent. So for example, in the employment context, many countries, the courts have said, if you want to process an employee's personal data on the basis of consent, that consent will most likely not be valid, because when you're in this employment relationship, there's this imbalance, and the employee will just sign and say yes to everything because they want the salary or they want the job. So there it won't be appropriate to rely on consent. So it really depends on the context, but in short, you don't always need someone's consent to process their data, and sometimes it won't be appropriate to use consent for processing of personal data. There are situations where you obviously need consent. So in many countries, special information like health information, that kind of information that's really sensitive, there you'll need consent. Unless and there are normally exceptions, like with all things, there's an exception to a rule. But with that kind of data, you normally need consent. In many countries, laws also, when you're dealing with children's information, you need the parents' consent, for example, to do something with that information.
Okay. Now, I'm learning so much. Everything seems brand new. And we learn a little bit about this at university from a governance perspective and some data privacy laws. But the issue is you learn it so briefly. It's very different from what I think the general conception is. Lots of misconceptions there. But now we have the data. Let's say everything is fine. We're allowed to use it. How can we use it to actually gain valuable insights? How can we use it without infringing on someone's rights? How do we use it respectfully and with purpose and legitimate interest, as you were saying. New words.
So that takes me back to the initial comment. If you're collecting the data, collect only such information as you really need, because otherwise you're creating a problem for yourself from the beginning. So if you need information, make sure that you only collect information that's attached to that need. Don't collect something for in case I might need this information later on. That doesn't work.
Get it then.
There are so many countries' laws will tell you can collect information only for an express, legitimate, legal consent. So you must know what that consent is before you collect the data. What that purpose is. You can't just collect data for and then figure out why you need the data. You first need to know why, and then you collect the data.
Already a PhD student, now you can ask. It's not for your future. Okay, with you.
So make sure that whatever you collect is limited to that.
Okay.
So data minimization is a very useful concept to remember. Minimize the data that you're collecting. Then also make sure that if you want to reuse that data, in many countries, they won't allow you to reuse that data for a totally different purpose unless you have consent.
Okay.
Unless somehow that purpose is linked, because that is a question that organizations often ask. They say, well, we have this mine of data. Can we now use it for this? So we are a supermarket and we've collected this data because we have a loyalty scheme, we have a card, and we have the customer's data for using the data. Now we want to sell this data to an insurance company. So the question there is that somehow linked to the original purpose? Is that compatible? Did the consumer realize when they signed up for this loyalty scheme that that information is going to be sold to an insurance company? If not, if you can't say that that's compatible, then you might have to get their consent, depending on which country you're in. But that's another thing. So if you have information, make sure what the purpose is, whether you can link it back to that original purpose. If you are relying on your legitimate interest, you have to do this balancing exercise and figure out you're going to use it for this purpose, but how is that going to affect the people? So could this create serious harm for them? Example, if you suddenly start using this data for that data without their consent. So you have to think about the context and how this might impact on the individual. So if you want to use the data, make sure that you're transparent about it from the beginning in your privacy notice, that people know what's going to happen to their data. So the concept, I think, is simple. If someone wants to give you their data and they know what you're going to do with it and they still carry on, you're in a much better position. Whereas if you just use the data and then suddenly everyone is shocked and surprised, that's probably going to lead to a problem for you.
A little bit, a tiny problem, tiny problem. This can be really risky, right? And obviously understand the risks, understand what you're getting into and why you're doing it. But what do you think is one of the parts of your personal information that's most vulnerable for being misused or abused? Or
you can approach that from different questions, but I think if you're the individual and you're worried, think about information that is sensitive, that you would not want other people to know. And that's why in many countries' laws, they talk about sensitive personal information or special category data. So that would be something about your health, your religion, political affiliation, trade union information, that kind of information that's sensitive to you, that could be abused, that could really lead to serious harm to you. And as an individual, that's information that you should be more careful about. Many laws create this special category to create more detailed and onerous obligations to protect you. But as an individual, it's your information. Once it's out there, it's out there. So that's why people should also be responsible with their information and think about what information they give someone when they're filling in a form, or they just want a product and they just give all this data out there so they can register and get the free information or free product or free service. So there is also a responsibility on you, and especially information that could lead to, for example, someone hacking into your bank account all those things we hear about so often that happen to other people, and somehow people think it won't happen to them and they're not careful enough. And the big risks are there. I think for cybersecurity, especially, information that someone can use to somehow get into some kind of account. If you think about all those password questions that many services
Your
ask
first
you.
grade teacher.
Yes, and then people will post pictures on Facebook of their first grade teacher looking back at way back when they have their reunion.
Yes.
And that's why I always say, really be careful what you put on social media, because that information can be abused and it can lead to serious harm for you. So you have to also exercise caution and be wise when you disclose your information or when you make it available to someone else there. And it's the same with companies. If you're dealing with that kind of information, your employees' information, or if you're in a very sensitive industry, in the medical industry, and you have your customers' medical data, their health information, be very careful, because if that information somehow gets exposed, it can lead to serious consequences for people.
And what do you think is one thing that we can all start doing to protect our businesses and ourselves?
To protect, I would say, apply basic concepts when it comes to security. Make sure that you are treating information in a secure way, all the good cyber security principles that you should follow to protect that information. But when it comes to data privacy law and compliance, I always find that people they're in this gray zone because they hear about all these laws and they don't really know what to do. And it's because they don't know what data they have. And that I think is if I could give organizations one tip, I would say, map your data. You need to figure out what information you're collecting, what kind of information it is, who it relates to, who are you sharing it with, what kind of security measures do you have in place to protect that data? Because how are you going to manage your data if you haven't mapped it, if you haven't created an inventory of the information, if you haven't created some kind of record that tells you this is what I'm doing with personal data? Because you can't look after something if you don't really know what you're looking at even.
Yeah.
So I always encourage organizations, and they don't like doing this, but you have to do this. You have to go on that fact-finding mission and look at your different sections of your organization and speak to those people and get someone in charge of each section, and then do a workshop and kick off a project and say, okay, we are going to figure out what information we have so that we can manage it responsibly and in compliance with all these legal requirements.
No, that makes sense. I think a lot of things are like that. You can't really budget if you don't know what you're spending your money on now.
Yeah.
You need to find out first.
Yeah.
And it's not a fun exercise, but it's a very, very important one, because then you have information and not just data points, and you can go forward and protect yourself and your business and the people whose data you have.
Yeah, it's very similar to budgeting. It's that old saying, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it.
100%.
So if it's, in this case, if you can't map the data, how are you going to manage it? Because you don't know what you're dealing with.
Yeah, cool, excellent. If there is one key takeaway that you would need our listeners to take away from this discussion, what do you think that is? It's the most important thing.
I'll go back to that one. You have to figure out what data you have. Then you can figure out how to make sure that you're using that data responsibly and that you can get intelligence out of the data. I think organizations always think of privacy laws as this barrier and it's going to make life very difficult for them. But if you follow the law and if you use the data in a compliant way, you can still achieve those business goals while at the same time respecting your consumers and making sure they trust you because you're using their data responsibly.
100%. And I mean, we all know when the trust is broken, it's broken. You can never go back. Excellent. On that note, thank you so much. I certainly learned a lot, Danie. I will be very careful of what I put on Facebook going forward. And I think it's also important to start mapping our own personal data and just understand what people know about you, who knows it, and why you gave it to them. So thank you so much. I hope to have a discussion again with you in the future.
That will be great. Thanks for having me.
Fantastic.
Thanks for tuning in to the Beyond Insights podcast. Please like and subscribe on whatever platform you're listening to right now. And please share with any of your colleagues or friends or family members that you think might benefit from listening to this podcast. That's all from us. Until next time, see you then.